In this lesson, I will show you how to use the previous tools and exercises to create a mobile phone body. I'm going to switch to the side view and create a rail surface. Take a look at the two layers I have from the previous exercise. It's the curves and surface. The curves one I'm going to turn invisible so that I can build for now the curves on the surface layer and later on assign them to the curves once I have some surfaces created. I'm going to start with a new curve with CVs. This is in the side view. This would become the center line if there was a side view available for this particular product. This is how I would start to just lay out the curve for this. Next would come a curve that is perpendicular to this one. I would start this by holding down Alt and Control and snapping the first CV to that curve. In order to build perpendicular from this towards us, or towards the view, I switch to the back view and use the middle mouse button to create the next CV over. Again, this is to ensure that if you're building with symmetry, that later on this surface can become seamless. The next two CVs, again, I can place them freely, switch to the perspective view, and create a rail surface. For this, go to Surfaces, Swept Surfaces, Rail Surface. This is going to be one generation and one rail curve. The rail, again, wants to be implied tangent. This is the generation, and this is the rail surface. Now, in order to evaluate this, I immediately go onto the Surface tool, turn on Symmetry, and make sure that there's no seams going across the center line. Once this is in place, I want to get into the habit of taking the curves that I've used, select Curve, and assign them onto the layer that is now invisible. Again, this way I can use them later on in case I need to make changes to the design. So with this in place, this will become the top surface of the product. And keep in mind that this lesson is for creating a mobile phone body. However, it could really be any product that you can come up with. I'm going to start now in the top view with a new curve. Going to hold down Alt to snap the first CV onto the grid. Use the right mouse button to place the next one perpendicular, and sketch out in the top view what I want the design to look like. Now, I purposely do this on the surface layer so I can see the symmetry. A lot of times if you're working with symmetry and you're trying to create a product, a lot of times it's difficult to evaluate what the actual shape will be if you just have the symmetry turned off. This way maybe the design looks fine, however with symmetry you may notice that it's possibly much too wide. So with this in place, I'm going to take the curve. I'm actually going to scale this one down. Now I only want to scale it in this view vertically, so I'm going to use the right mouse button for scale. This will allow me to get a little bit better idea of the form and shape that I want. Once this is in place, I'm going to create another curve that I will use as a character line around it so I can create a little bit of a bevel. Now for this, notice the grid spacing here. I do want to place the next curve onto the grid. However, I can't do that right now because there's not an intersection here. So I'm just going to place this first CV roughly in that vicinity, but use the right mouse button to place the next one, and then slowly trace around my object. And notice how I'm trying to get closer and closer to the original shape so that it becomes somewhat of a tapered form. Now for this last CV, I will use Alt key on your keyboard and the right mouse button to again get this perpendicular. Now before I create a surface with this, keep in mind that you need to go back to this CV and snap it vertically onto the grid. Go to Move, hold on Alt, and click on the right mouse button. Again, right mouse button is vertical constraint. At this point, you can do some more iterations with the design or flow of the curves if you like. I might want to go ahead and taper or adjust the form a little bit. However, for this particular design, I want to make sure that the CVs do not cross over like this, unless that is really the intent of the design. A lot of times it's easy to accidentally create a very shallow dent in the surface unless you really make sure that they're all lined up on the outside of the curve, or unless your design really is asking for a form such as this one. So for now I'm going to leave these over on this side, and let's say that this is roughly the form that I want. I'm going to project these two curves onto the surface. However, I'm going to use two different methods. The first one, the inner one, this is the one that I'm going to use to actually physically trim the surface. So I'm going to create curves on surface, project, and again, curves on surface is what I want for this one. Click on Go, click on the curve, and confirm by pressing on the spacebar. So this now, if you look in the perspective window, this is a curve on surface. Can be selected with curve on surface. This is what I can use to physically trim that surface out later on. This will become the top part of the product. For this outer one, I'm going to switch back to the top view. However, I'm going to project this one in a different way. I'm going to go back to the Create Curves on Surface tool, Project Options, but this time I'm going to choose Curves, and I'm going to turn off Match Original and Create History. The curves, you will see in a moment, I'm going to click on this one. This will create a physical curve that follows the surface. So this one is not one that I'm going to use for trimming. I'm going to accept this one for now. I'm going to go back to the perspective view. This is a physical curve that has been projected onto the surface. However, it's not linked to it. So if I select the surface, it's still a separate entity. And this one I can move and change and do something with. Now, the reason why I project it onto the surface is, if you take a look at the, for example, back view, notice that it still follows the overall flow of the surface. It would be almost impossible for me to sketch out a curve like this because of its rather complex flow and continuation that it has. So with this one in place, this one I'm going to move very slightly downwards. I'm going to use this to create a small beveled edge here. I'm going to take my surface, go to Surface Edit, Trim Surface, keep just this middle or inner part, confirm with the spacebar. And just so you can see a little bit better what I'm doing, I'm going to start taking these curves on the bottom and assign them onto the invisible curves layer. Here's now top surface, and again this one that's slightly lower that I can use to create a little beveled round. Move this one just slightly further down like this. And to create a rail surface now, all I need is two connecting generation curves at the front and back, or top and bottom of this product. I'm going to turn off symmetry here just so you see a little bit better what's going on. I want to create a generation curve that starts here and ends there. So for this, in the perspective view, I'm going to start with a new curve here, and I'm going to hold down Alt Control, click on the edge of that surface, and drag it all the way to the end. That ensures that this particular CV is snapped right onto that intersection. Now to sketch it out, I'm going to actually switch to the side view so I can see a little bit better what that cross section would look like. I'm going to give this a very subtle arch and switch back to the perspective view to place the last CV onto the first one of this curve. So again, in the side view, I want to have a very subtle arch. I want to make sure that this looks the way I wanted it to. And I'm going to repeat this process for the other side back here. So go to Pick Nothing. I'm still in the Curve tool, as you can see in the prompt line. Hold down Alt Control, slide this first CV there, switch to the back view, or side view rather. Place two more CVs and place the last one so it touches that curve. So the moment that you have a four-sided surface mapped out, that's what this is, four sides, I can use the Rail tool for this. Go to Surfaces, Swept Surfaces, Rail Surface. In here I want to choose two generation curves and two rail curves. Now typically you could choose either the longer ones or the shorter ones as the generation curves. However, I like to make it a habit of just keeping the shorter curves as generation curves. In this particular case, it's the generation curves that rest along the center line. So those are the ones that I want to switch to implied tangent. Generation 1 and generation 2. So I'm going to start with this. Generation 1, rotate to the other side. Generation 2, and then rail 1 and rail 2. Now take a look at the surface that has been created. It does say that I have implied tangency. That is a good thing. However, take a look at the surface itself. It does have quite a few isoparms, and it looks like they're going, in some cases, at a bit of an angle. I'm a particular concern about having a few that are very close to each other. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to allow the software to rebuild this surface, or rather the edge, or one of the two edges that is being used. In this case, this top edge was a trimmed surface. Typically that's the one that might cause the amount of isoparms that I have here. So I'm going to go ahead for rail 1 and try the rebuild function. Now notice how this instantly cleaned up that surface. Typically the one thing that you want to be aware of, if this goes into rapid prototyping, by rebuilding you're allowing the software to make a bit of a adjustment to your surface. Take a look at this area here. So there's a very subtle gap over here and a very subtle one over there. Now this can be fixed in a variety of ways. One of them would be the construction options up here, depending on what tolerances you're working with. Or if this is something that really only needs to be for visual evaluation, I'm probably going to be okay with this. Another option is to, well, leave it as is, or try rebuilding the bottom edge of this, because ultimately I will not use this particular curve anymore. I will use in a moment the edge of this surface to create a surface that goes down, which will be a lofted draft surface. So with this in place, it's always a good idea to quickly evaluate if what you've done is correct. So for this, select the curve. Again, I'm going to assign it onto the invisible layer, same as the two generation curves. I don't need those for now. And turn on symmetry and evaluate the surface. So it looks like I have tangency over here. Again, still the top surface is nice and tangent, as well as this one over here. Later on, I'm going to add very, very small fillet or round surface around here, just to kind of smoothen things out a bit, or unless the design is asking for a physical step, then this would be okay as well. So at this stage, I'm going to start using a new tool. It's located under Surfaces, Draft Surfaces, Draft Flange. I'm going to go to the options and leave the options open. Click on the edge of the surface. Now, one of the reasons why I like to put the curves away so that I don't accidentally choose the wrong element in here. But this way, when I click on this, there's only the surface edge that I can choose from. Click on the Go button, and notice that you instantly get a draft surface that, in this case, first of all, is going in the wrong direction, possibly is too large. However, you will see that the Draft Flange surface tool is very, very powerful in quickly creating a straight surface that also allows you for adding draft angles. In this case, I'm just going to choose 180, which will turn it in the other direction. Again, if this was a rapid prototyping model, you could specify a specific draft angle, 181, or otherwise. You can also use these handles to interactively change the draft angle. There's a bunch of options in here that you can play with as far as the direction goes, angles in all directions, and so forth. Let me do this again. Draft Surfaces, Draft Flange. I'm going to choose 180. Confirm, and there is my draft surface. Now this surface is much too long for what I want. I could adjust it in the surface depth. I could try and get this precise. However, for now I'm just going to leave it at 1, because I'm going to bring out another surface to actually trim the bottom out. So at this point I'm happy with the way this looks. I'm going to turn off symmetry, because now I'm bringing out a surface in the top view, just a plane, that I will use to trim this out. I could theoretically, for the bottom surface, create another rail, just like the top one was. However, I'm going to bring out a plane for this. I'm going to make the bottom of this phone completely flat. And I'm placing it somewhere in this vicinity and scale it to a size 2. Again, I'm working with the grid here, so I know that the grid is 2 units over in this direction. So by placing the plane right here, I can just scale it, and I will know exactly that the edge of that plane is right on the center line of the x-axis. This is important because, again, I'm working with symmetry. I don't want to have it slightly over there or slightly over there. I want this to be precise. So let's switch to the side view. And this plane is what I'm going to use to create the actual depth or height of this product. So I'm going to move it to where approximately I think the design would want to be, somewhere here. And now I have a few options on how to trim or create a round surface. Again, there's the options of intersecting these and trimming and rounding, or I can also try to use the surface fillet tool. Again, I'm going to leave that window open. That was under surfaces, surface fillet. Choose the first one, which in this case is going to be the draft surface. This one wants to go to the inside, so I click on this. Also, I think a radius of 1 might be way too large, so I'm going to start with something much smaller, 0.2. Click accept. Choose the plane. Make sure that the arrow is going up. Click on accept. And here is the draft surface. I'm sorry, the surface fillet surface along the draft surface. Now this radius might be a little bit large, so I'm going to turn on auto recalc. Choose a smaller one. Let's try 0.5, and this now becomes a nice small surface fillet along the edge. And again, the advantage is that you didn't have to intersect or trim. This tool does it all for you. At this stage, I'm going to go ahead and save this. It's always a good idea to use save. It's always a good idea to use save as. So for this one, I'm going to call this Frito Mobile. And again, in between, always try to use symmetry to make sure that the design is exactly what you want. So now that the main piece of the body is done, I'm going to start and create a small floating surface that I'm going to use for some sort of a screen or interface. The purpose of this demo is to show you a couple more tools. First one is I could just create, again in the top view, a plane just like I did the bottom. However, for this I want to use the offset tool. That one is located under Object, Edit, Offset. And this one is an interactive tool. So if I click on it, it gives you a preview of, right now, a distance of 1, if you look at the prompt line, of what this surface may look like. Now the advantage of an offset versus a scaled surface is very, very powerful if you take a look at it based from a curve standpoint of view. In other words, before I do this, let me show you something real quick. In the side view, I'm just going to create two curves. Here's a curve. If I create a scaled duplicate of this, I'm going to go to Duplicate Object, center the pivot, and scale the duplicate. Notice what happens. I get an equal distance more or less here. That's based to the proximity of the pivot. However, take a look over here in this area. This is where things overlap. This is just duplicate and scale. Here's what the offset tool will do. If you go to Object, Edit, Offset, it will allow you to create a precise, equally distanced copy of this. And this is what I want for the top surface. Object, Edit, Offset. I want something that has the same flow as my main surface. I'm just going to choose a very small distance in between these two. Right now it's 0.73, 0.07. Let's do it a precise number. And when you're happy with this, click on Accept, and it will create this floating surface above. Again, this is what's going to be used to create a little screen. Switch to the top view. Now for the screen, I could choose just about any shape that I desire. However, for this, I'm going to work with a curve primitive. I'm going to choose a circle. In the options, I'm going to make this 180 degrees and choose maybe 6 sections. That's plenty. Click on Go, and I'm going Alt on the keyboard to snap it to the grid. I'm going to scale this down. It's on the opposite side, so rotate it 0 space 180. That flips it in the Z-axis to the other side. And this one here, going to scale up a little bit. I'm again creating two versions of this. One that is going to be on the outside surface, the offset I've just created, and another one that is going to be on the original top surface. So once I got the first one in place, make a copy and scale the copy slightly like this. Now for this, I want to project these two onto the two surfaces, and I want to use curves on surface. So I'm going to start with the inner one. That's the body of the cell phone. Switch to the top view. Remember, when you go to create surfaces project, to go back to curves on surface. And I'm also going to create history again because I may want to adjust this slightly. Click on go, and for that surface choose the outer one. It's going to look like this. Curve on surface that I can use for trimming. For the offset one, switch back to the top view and project on there the inner, smaller one. Confirm with the spacebar. So now I have two curves on surface here. These are the ones I'm going to use for trimming this surface out. Go to Surface Edit, Trim, Trim Surface. Again, for the outer one, keep this small floating portion. For the lower one, keep this part of the body. Now once this is in place, you will notice that you have a small floating surface that has the same overall flow as the one below it. Again, it's always a good idea to start in evaluating this, especially with symmetry on. This is somewhat what this may look like. All that's left to do for this is to create a small rail surface around here. Before I do that, again, you can, once you have these curves, if they're created with construction history, there is a possibility to slightly adjust either the design or even to slightly move them for precise placement. So once this is in place, I'm going to turn symmetry off again. Get into the habit of selecting the curves and assigning them onto the curves layer, like this. And I can now create a small rail that goes around here. Now for this, previously when I placed the curve over here, I just used the CVs to place it in the side view. In this case, I'm going to use a curve with edit points. This is going to allow me to hold down Alt Control, snap the first edit point on that edge and the next one over here. So this is a fast way of just creating a perfectly straight curve in between 2 points. I'm going to repeat the process over here. Go to Pick Nothing and place the next 2 edit points onto the edges of the 2 trims. If I'm going to rail this surface now, I will get a very clean chisel or bevel look. However, for this particular exercise or demonstration, I want to create a surface that hopefully will appear very tangent and integrated into the main body. So it's a very soft transition. For that, I have basically 2 options. I could rail this surface and use the round tool on both sides here to create a small round or fillet. Could also use the surface fillet tool. However, I'm going to try to create a surface that is tangent to begin with. For that, I need to adjust these CVs a little bit, and I'm going to show you a tool that can place the second CVs somewhat more in line with the surface that they're next to. That tool is under Curve, Edit, Project, Tangent. Here's how I'm going to use this tool. I'm not going to go to the options. I'm just going to click on the tool. It's asking me to select Curve to modify. I'm going to click on the edge of the curve and the edge of the surface, and notice what happens. It gives you a manipulator. I'm not going to touch that one, but take a look at the second CV here. It moved this one up to be in line with the surface. I'm going to go to Pick Nothing. Do this again on this side over here. Click on the edge of the curve, take a look at this CV, and click on the edge of the surface. It moves that one down so it's lined up with that surface edge. This makes this into an S curve that flows a little bit better with the 2 surfaces. It's going to help the rail surface to become more tangent to those 2 floating parts. Repeat this over here. Click on the edge of the curve, edge of the surface, Pick Nothing, edge of the curve, edge of the surface and pick nothing. So now that we're at this stage, I can go back to the rail surface tool, and this becomes a little bit more tricky. I want to have both generation curves to be implied tangent and both rail curves to be tangent. Now, depending on how I constructed this may or may not 100% work. However, let's give this a shot. Generation 1, generation 2, rail 1 for the top one, rail 2 for the bottom. And here it does give me implied tangency, and it's calling this tangent on these two edges. Now keep in mind that rail 2 was still under the rebuild option. Without this, notice that there's still tangency, but a whole lot more isoparms in between. So again, depending on what effect you're going for, whether it's precision for prototyping or just a visual representation, in this case it's for visual representation, the rebuild option definitely helped this to be evenly spaced in terms of its isoparms. So at this stage, the main body would be ready for evaluation. I'm going to take the curves that I used, those two, assign them, and turn on the symmetry of the product. Turn on diagnostic shading and evaluate. And again, it's a good idea sometimes to do the evaluation without the geometry in the way. It's the F12 button. And also you can evaluate this without the grid on, which is on the window toggles grid. F12 for the model. You can get a little bit better idea of what you're doing. So once you're happy with this, or your client, what you can do is either sketch over this for some of the details, or, which I will show you in the next segment, is how to create some quick part lines and details to start and finish this a little bit more. So moving right along with starting to give this product somewhat of a detail level, I'm going to switch back to the top view for this, turn symmetry off, press on F12 to get my geometry back. I'm going to turn off diagnostic shading. So in this case, there's a few things that I may want to do with this in terms of giving it some detail. One of them could be in the top view some cut lines or lines that describe surface separation. So for instance, I could create a curve here in the top view that would indicate some sort of a material break. I can also create a curve, which I will do in a moment here, that will give it some additional detail. But before I do anything in the top view that may affect the entire surface, I'm actually going to give this in the side view a part line down the center. There's a few options for that. One of them is always that I can create a rail surface, or if the part line would actually go perfectly straight through it, I could just use a plane, just like I did the bottom surface here, that I intersect with it. As a matter of fact, I like a lot of times just to recycle surface. Recycling means I already have this one surface in place here. I'm going to make a duplicate of that, move the duplicate up, untrim it, pick the curve on surface, and use this to create possibly a part line. Now for part lines, remember that there were a few different options that you have available for part lines. What I could do is, if this is a real product, I could use this surface plane to start and create two separate parts for both the top and the bottom one. However, for this, it's for visual representation only. I'm just going to use this plane to intersect with the side surface. I could have also projected this one on there. However, all I want is a curve on surface, because I want to use the part line tools that I showed earlier to try and create just visual representation for that sort of separation that would happen right around that product there. So I'm going to use the fillet flange for this. Leave the window open, click on the edge. I have to find the locator here, it's on the other side. I have to make sure that this one is not too large and that it's going in the correct direction. So for this one here, I do want to make the radius a little bit smaller, probably 0.05 in this case. And I'm going to start and make sure that it's pointing inwards. As a matter of fact, I'm going to go a little bit smaller with this, maybe 0.3. Click on the button in the bottom right. This starts to create the first line. Click on Next. Click on this curve on surface again. Make sure it's flipped in the opposite direction. And there's the first indication of a part line. Now keep in mind that when you use this particular technique, that there's actually 3 curves on surfaces, the 2 new ones and the original one in the center. So that original one in the center I don't need anymore. So I'm going to use the delete button just to get rid of this. And I could now at this point start to trim divide this surface. I like to trim divide in this case and not trim the middle away, because I may want to assign different shaders to the top and bottom of this. So with this surface I like to select all 3 areas, use the divide button, so that I get, first of all, let's try this again. This draft surface is actually made up of 3 ones that are grouped together. So when I selected this just a moment ago, notice that it selected it as 1. So I want to make sure I use Pick Component to select only this middle segment and delete it. So this is how I get a quick indication of a part line on here, down the draft surface. I also want to use the round tool or the surface fillet tool to quickly round these edges off slightly. Let's try the round tool first. I'm going to choose round. I'm going to choose a very small radius for this, probably 0.05. Let's see what this looks like. Now notice that the round tool is actually overextending this particular surface, so it does have a little bit of difficulty in really finding this particular edge. Now I could cut this off on its own, or I'm just going to try a different tool for this. Revert the 9.0. This was done by selecting it first. I can also try to use again the surface fillet tool for this. Make sure that this arrow is pointing inwards, and that for this surface also it's pointing inwards. Click on Accept. See if this works here. And this tool seems to be working a little bit better. I think that this radius is a little bit too large. I wanted a very, very subtle one. So I'm going to try and choose a smaller one, 0.025. And this is roughly around the area of where I wanted the size of that radius to be. I can now try to repeat this with the top part of the bevel and also the top part of the surface, and hopefully this is going to work equally well, just to get a very subtle transition between all these surfaces. If I take a look at this now, always want to double check this in the shaded mode. F12 will help you evaluate this a little bit better. Now take a look at these facets here. This is not something that's alarming. That is something that is only caused by the tolerance over here in the diagnostic shading. I could make this a lower number, but to really truly evaluate the surface, notice how this evened it out, I would probably make a rendering at this point. But this is good enough for this. I'm going to switch the tolerance back to a slightly higher number, just so it doesn't slow me down too much. Bring the geometry back, switch back to the top view, and now I can start to, for example, create a detail over here, which I can use for surface separation. And also in the top view I'm going to start to add some more detail elements. Let's start with some more circles. I have a circle here. I'm going to scale it down, rotate it 180 just to bring it on this side of the geometry. I'm going to scale this one down a little bit. This could become some sort of a small camera detail or something along those lines. I'm going to make a copy of this. On this floating top surface, I want to actually bring out a screen area and trim divide this as well. Now notice what I've just done here. I've just placed a copy of this particular circle over on this end. Now the problem with this is probably never going to be really centered between the two edges here, meaning there's probably some sort of a small difference between the distances. So this is one of the reasons or occasions where I want to quickly go back to my curves layer, select an existing one that has its pivot in the center, make a duplicate, scale the duplicate, and this duplicate I'm going to assign onto my working layer, which right now is called surface. So this was one of a good example of why you always want to keep your original curves. I can scale this one down a little bit. And now I'm going to decide to maybe sort of create some sort of a geometry or design that connects these two. So I'm going to bring out another curve using edit points that I'm going to start somewhere over here, and with the middle mouse button bring a curve over to this end. Now the problem with this is I want these all to be connected and to be one. So for that I'm going to start to take this CV over here, use move, hold down control, and snap it onto that particular curve edge from this one. Also maybe I want to, while I'm at this, adjust the height of this. Select this CV, snap it onto that one over there. Something along the lines of this. Now before this can really work, if this is really one entire surface detail, I may want to have this actually be one curve. In other words, right now it's individual pieces. To make it into one, I would use the attach tool, object edit attach, and here I'm going to try and definitely use the blend tool, inserting a span, and possibly keep the originals if I'm not really sure what the result will be. However, for this I'm just going to turn it off, zoom into this area and attach these two together. This is now one, and also attach these two together so that also this becomes one. So all of a sudden I have one curve that has a perfect circular arrangement of CVs here, a straight line, and another circular element here. This now is what I could use to create curves on surface and create a detail. So what I've done here is now selected the three top surfaces, and in the top view project that curve onto the surface using curves on surface again. Choose the curve, confirm, and I now have sort of the first indication of some sort of a detail here. This is now something I could use to either trim divide or try to create a part line, very small one, and then later on add some more details such as cameras and so forth. Now keep in mind that the curves on surfaces are separate. Even though I used one solid curve, because it's going over three separate surfaces, these are all individual parts. This is going to become a little bit tricky, but I'm going to try and create a part line out of this. Let's try to use this with the tools that we used earlier, fillet flange. I could also try to use the tubular offset, and the tube flange would work equally well, but let's try the fillet flange for now. I would click on this edge, and I would choose a much smaller radius than the one that you see here. The reason being is, if I'm looking at this bend over here, this one might cause some problems, same as the one over there, and also the transition over here. So I want to use something much more subtle than this. So for this I'm going to use 0.01. It's a very small one. Zoom in here, you can see it. And let's give this a shot. Click on Recalc. And notice that it did build it all the way up until this edge. I do get somewhat of a concentration of isoparms here. And the problem is also that I actually wanted this to go all the way around the entire three segments. So I'm going to undo this. But I know that this number works. So notice that I'm clicking on the other curves on surfaces as well. And let's see if I can get a continuation over all three. Notice that this seemed to have worked. If I take a look at the transitions here, got three separate elements. So if this is something that worked, I can click on next. I can choose to do the opposite side. Just use the flip button here and the fillet. Choose the second and also third segment. Confirm the selection. And if this works, all I need to do afterwards is clean up the additional curves on surface that I don't need, and I can then trim out that segment. Seems like this worked. So I go to pick nothing, pick curve on surface. Again, I want to choose the one that I don't need, which is in between. That was just used for construction. And I want to go ahead and delete that one, including some of the others that may still be in there that I don't need. So let's start deleting this one. Go to delete active. Also choose the one over here, which is the middle one. And finally the one over here. Now take a look at this closely. There is curves on surface here. Those are the ones that I need for trimming. However, remember that I chose not to create a flange. It still creates curves on surfaces on the bottom of the fillets here. So those I can also go ahead and delete if I don't need them. And I'm left with two curves on surfaces going around here. Again, this is what I'm going to use to again trim divide this. Trim surface. Click on this area, the outside area, and to choose the in between, I'm zooming in here so I'm really sure that I'm selecting the right thing. Now for this, if this works, again choosing an object in this case works because this was a different surface type on how I created the original one, which was a rail. I can delete this one. I can repeat this process over here by going to trim surface, choose this one, and the one over here. Divide this. Pick the rail surface in between. And do this one more time for the surface over here. Surface edit, trim, trim surface, divide the two outside and the one in between. And there's the rail surface that I no longer need. So at this point, sometimes when I lose it, I just use Alt-L to quickly zoom in again. Notice that there's still something going on and somewhere in this area. That's probably a leftover curve on surface. So I like to go to pick curve on surface and just select over the entire area to delete any sort of excess parts that are there. So with this now in place, what I could do is add some more revolved shapes here, keep on trim dividing. However, for this part, all I'm going to do is project this curve that I earlier did in the top view onto my surfaces and do one more trim divide and assign some different colors for the diagnostic shading so you can see a little bit what this will look like. So for that, I'm going to choose all of these surfaces in the top view, F5, use this one to project it onto it. Create curves on surface, project, choose this one, and I will now start to trim divide some of these things. So for that, go to trim surface. I'm going to start with the top one. Divide these two areas. Now for the next one here, the small surface fillet that I created, I want to make sure that I zoom into this area so I can choose this and this side. And there's something else that you need to keep in mind when you doing this with the surface fillet, which is all the way over here on the other side. The surface actually continues. So here I have another passing of the curve on surface. I want to make sure that I also pick this one to divide this. Same thing goes for this surface. I got two over here, but also on this side I need to make sure that I'm also choosing that one. Do this one more time over here. Select the surface, divide these two areas, and the one over here. Now on to the next one over there, and there's one last one that I'm going to do, which is the one that rolls underneath here for the part line. Now with this in place, I can now start to assign different colored diagnostic shading, just to kind of start and see where this is going. For that, take all the curves, assign them away. Let's take a look at this thing all in one. This is what it looks like now. Take a look at this little piece here that appears to be missing. Again, that's the same general thing that can be fixed in the diagnostic shading. That's just the way the tolerance of the tessellator works. And for this now, to really accurately see or get a first feel for the separation of the elements, this is where I would go ahead and start assign a little bit of different colors to this. First of all, for the entire color, I think this blue tone is fine. Again, if you just click on color, this way you can adjust things slightly if you want. But I'm going ahead and switch to pick component, so I can start to select some of these surfaces in here. So for that, what I would probably start with is use some of these surfaces that are on the inside. This is where I like to zoom in, just to make sure I'm really selecting the right ones. Same for, I'm going to choose half of my part line that I've made, which is this half. Choose these over here. Also make sure that on the other side of this trim divide I can choose the extra components over here. And finally also select the inside of that fillet that I've created. So once these are all selected, these are now the ones that I can give them a different tone if I like. If they're still active, if I just click on color, I could give this a gray tone or something like this. And so finally, once I'm at this stage, I'm going to turn symmetry back on, so we can see sort of what the effect will be of this whole thing. If this is something that your client or you yourself then at this stage like, use the Save As button, give this a new number. It's going to be number 2. And this is then where I would go ahead and add even more detail. And also probably at some point for this file, because it's saved, I can go ahead and delete the construction history so that modeling becomes a little bit faster, so not everything updates at this stage. So go ahead and try to create some of your own detailing. In the next lesson, I'm going to introduce you to some of the camera, shader, and lighting effects that you can achieve within the Studio Tools software.